Hello, my name is Olivia Ming. Today is May 12th, 2021, and I will be discussing the feedback loops in the non-gravid female reproductive system. So first, I will be discussing the anatomy of the female reproductive system. So here we have a diagram of the internal reproductive structures. And right here we have the ovaries, and in the ovaries we have the cortex, which is where the follicles are produced, and in the middle, or the medulla, we have blood vessels and nerves that supply growth of these follicles. And ovaries are important because they secrete gametes and hormones, as well as release the eggs through these follicles. And right here we have the fimbriae, which take up the eggs from the ovaries and take them through these fallopian tubes and are taken into the uterine cavity. So this is the uterus, and this is the cervix, and this is the vagina. Alright, so next we're going to talk about the menstrual cycle. So we refer to the menstrual cycle as the menstrual cycle because they are marked by a 3 to 7 day period of bloody uterine shedding or menstruation. It is the cyclic production of eggs and preparation of the uterus for pregnancy. Occurs in monthly cycles, typically 24 to 35 days, but typically it will be 28 days on average. And it's divided into phases that we're going to be discussing. They're based on the events in the ovaries and the uterus. So the ovarian cycle is the monthly cycle of egg development in the ovaries, and the uterine cycle are the changes in the endometrial lining of the uterus. So this slide shows, through this diagram, the ovarian and uterine cycles, and they overlap. They're occurring at the same time. So first we'll discuss the ovarian cycle, and this is during a 28-day menstrual cycle. We begin with the follicular phase, and this is where the follicle is developing. You can see that right here. And then we have ovulation, which is where the follicle will release the egg. And then we have the luteal phase, and during this phase, the follicle becomes the corpus luteum and secretes some hormones, and then dies by apoptosis. It kind of looks like a little popcorn right here. And then during the uterine cycle, we begin during early follicular phase, we have menses. And this is when the uterus is undergoing menstruation, or the shedding of the endometrial lining. Then we have the proliferative phase, and during this phase, it's right before ovulation, in late follicular phase leading up to ovulation. It's when the endometrium is proliferating, which means growing, to prepare for potential pregnancy. And then the last phase of the uterine cycle is the secretory phase, and that's occurring during the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. And it's when the endometrium becomes a secretory in response to progesterone, which is secreted by these little popcorn cells, the corpus luteum. And that is also in preparation for a potential pregnancy. All right, so this is an overview of the hormonal control of the menstrual cycle. We'll be looking at this diagram right here in different panels, and it will go into detail of each 4 of these different panels over the next few slides. But first, so this is the menstrual cycle is under control of hormones, which create these positive and negative feedback loops. So GnRH, which is a gonadotropin releasing hormone, it's released from the hypothalamus, and it causes the release of FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, or luteinizing hormone, from the anterior pituitary. And estrogen, progesterone, inhibin, and AMH, or anti-Müllerian hormone, are all released from the ovary. And these hormones are very specific to each phase and their actions in each phase. And now let's get into the early follicular phase. So during this phase, the GnRH releases FSH and LH to be released. GnH causes FSH and LH to be released from the anterior pituitary, I should say. And FSH causes a group of tertiary follicles in the ovaries to begin maturation. And over here, we can see GnRH from the hypothalamus stimulating the anterior pituitary, FSH and LH. And then these follicle cells, granulosa cells, which are under the influence of FSH, these produce AMH and estrogen. And then we have LH, which is under thecal cells, which is under the influence of LH, pardon me. And the thecal cells produce androgens, and the androgens get converted into estrogen. So there's a huge increase in estrogen during this phase. And then the negative feedback loop on FSH, LH, and GnRH secretion prevents multiple follicles from growing. We only want one follicle to grow. And then there's a positive feedback loop on increased estrogen production by granulosa cells. Like I said, there's a lot of estrogen production in this phase, and the endometrium begins to proliferate or grow after menstruation. So menstruation had just occurred, which is the end of this phase, the menstrual cycle. So at the beginning, it's proliferating in response to estrogen, increased estrogen. All right, the mid to late follicular phase in ovulation. So ovulation, or ovarian estrogen production peaks, and only one follicle still developing. Granulosa cells of the dominant follicle begin secreting inhibin and progesterone, and FSH is being suppressed by inhibin. Estrogen feedback loop on GnRH changes from negative to positive, so this is going to cause a surge in GnRH, or gonadotropin releasing hormone. And the rising progesterone and high estrogen enhance anterior pituitary responsiveness to GnRH, leading to a surge in LH, which is important because it causes the oocyte in the follicle to mature into a state where it can be released. This peak in LH will also cause ovulation to occur within 16 to 24 hours. And ovulation is where the follicle in the ovary releases an egg. And the follicle remains in the ovary, but the egg, surrounded by a few layers of granulosa cell, will be taken up by the fimbriae and brought into the fallopian tube and then the uterus. Next, we have the early to mid luteal phase. The follicular thecal cells and granulosa cells turn into the corpus luteum, or those little popcorn cells. This produces estrogen and progesterone, mainly progesterone. And the progesterone and estrogen exert a negative feedback loop on the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. I'm sorry. And gonadotropin secretion remains shut off during most of this phase by the luteal inhibin production. So there's no GnRH, no LH, or even FSH. So there is no follicle stimulation because these hormones are what will stimulate the follicle to grow. And the endometrium becomes a secretory structure due to the stimulation by progesterone via the corpus luteum. And last but not least, we have the late luteal phase and menstruation. So the corpus luteum it undergoes apoptosis after approximately 12 days if the pregnancy does not occur. The corpus luteum, like I said, dies, causing progesterone and estrogen production to decrease, which removes that negative feedback loop. The negative feedback loop causes the release, once again, of GnRH, FSH, and LH, so the whole cycle is going to start again. And this is when menstruation begins, because there's no more progesterone, like I said, and the endometrium sloughs off the surface layer, and that's when menstruation begins. And the release of gonadotropin starts a new cycle of follicular development. So we're going to have a new follicle begin to develop, and this whole cycle will start again. And my source was the Human Physiology and Integrated Approach textbook by D. Silverthorne. Thank you.